Grazie a tutti. It has been a number of years now since my friend Bruno Amoroso first urged me to come to these meetings in Sorrento. And I must say I'm very, very glad to be here at long last. I do want to say by way of beginning that along with many others who were here, I have been profoundly influenced over many years by the thinking of Bruno Amoroso. And I know that for many of us, he is with us here today in spirit. At the start of the session this afternoon, the initial slide put up by the very first speaker or chairman noted that we are at the end of an era, at a moment when the economic models on which so many have relied for half a century can no longer guarantee the maintenance, let alone a continuing rise in living standards for all of our population. That's very much also my thinking. And I want to spend the little time I have today articulating for you a little bit of why I think that is the case. It should, first of all, by now, be clear to every thinking person that the expectation of full recovery and a return to the 20th century, second half of the 20th century pattern of economic growth following the world financial crisis 6 years ago on the basis of established patterns of policy was delusional. It was an illusion. Not that the world of politics abjures delusions. On the contrary, delusion is the stock in trade of a great deal of political life. I read this morning, for example, that the Troika, in its wisdom, has decided on an even more rigorous program of what they call conditionality, austerity, in fact, punishment, for Greece. And I read in the press from my country that the Republicans, who are assuming the control of the United States Congress in a few months, have as their major agenda a balanced budget. These are examples of the politics of delusion and self-delusion. Good luck to them. It is our responsibility, on the other hand, to keep alive, to the extent possible, the ancient and honorable distinction between sense and nonsense, and the endangered tradition of critical thought. Now, there is a tendency in our time of what I might call uncritical criticism, coming from all parts of the political spectrum, which holds that if only policies had been different, if only smarter economists had been in charge, then the outcomes would have been different and we would have returned to the previous patterns of growth and expansion. On the left, people say there should have been more stimulus. On the right, they say there should have been less intervention. In my view, this is too easy. A better starting point is to ask how and why the conditions that we face have become more difficult. And then to ask, how should we react? I have a new book. It's called The End of Normal. It will appear in Italian, thanks to the Eurispes Foundation, and in which I try to articulate the major reasons, in my view, why the period in which we live is a more difficult period, why it meets this standard of end of an era that's already been mentioned. And I call attention principally to four major factors. The first of them is energy, and both the cost and the volatility due to financialization, due to the new presence of financial forces in energy markets, of energy and resources in general. The cost for a country that uses energy and must import it of resources affects the profitability of activity. The volatility affects confidence in the future and the prospects for investment. Prices are expected to go up. That will limit investment in energy-using activities. If they're expected to go down, it will limit investment in alternatives. If they're expected to fluctuate, you have difficulties on both sides. This factor was entirely overlooked in the economic growth models of the neoclassical period for 50 years. In fact, mention of it was highly discouraged, now obvious, apparent to everyone. And not least because in the United States, everybody, I think, now understands that we have having a relatively easier time because of the happenstance of a boom in gas coming from shale. How long it will last is another matter. The climate costs of that particular new enterprise, as well as of the entire planet's appetite for energy, will be paid later, are not directly part of what I'm talking about now. If they were, then the pressures to appreciate and adapt to the end of the era would be even more dramatic on us today than they are. Second broad area is the global security situation. Now that in the post-war period, two different world orders have come to an end, the Cold War and the Pax Americana, which was intended to follow it after the Soviet Union disintegrated. Both of these things have now faded away. The Cold War by the voluntary action of one of the major protagonists, thanks to President Gorbachev, and the Pax Americana, thanks to the realization of the world that military force, no matter how predominant one country's forces may be, simply is not a very useful thing for stabilizing the world system. And so we live today in a world where the prospect for security is substantially less clear than it was even 20 years ago. And we have to think about how to adapt to that and what the best ways are, including perhaps relocalization, to provide for ourselves the necessary elements of security for economic stability. A third major area seems to me to be strongly affecting our economic prospects, and particularly the prospects for employment, is the evolution of technological change. The long aftermath of the digital revolution. Technology is very much a two-edged sword. Examples of the new technologies are all around us in this room. There's that camera, there's this computer, there's my little smartphone, there's my watch. And we all, to some degree, benefit from them. But from the business point of view, they have a strong element of labor saving. They make it possible for businesses, and increasingly as the range of the technologies expands, this extends to all aspects of the profit-making, nonprofit, and public spheres, they make it possible to not hire people to do tasks for which people were necessary until very recently. And this is evident, I think, in our lives all around us, even though the economics profession still seems to be somewhat confused about the matter. What does that mean? It means that as we go forward, we have to rethink in a radical way how people spend their time, how to divide our lives between a working period and a period after work, how to make the age of retirement decent and comfortable for larger numbers of people, but also how to employ people outside of the profit-making sphere to provide the institutions, whether in the public sector or the nonprofit sector, that can give people meaningful and useful things to do and that can fulfill the tasks that society requires to be filled. We have not even begun that, and because we have not escaped the habits of thought of the previous period, we are actually moving in the wrong direction. And the result, high unemployment, particularly high youth unemployment, is everywhere around us. We will be paying the price for this for decades if we don't act on it now. The fourth area has to do with the financial system, the dysfunction in particular of a world dominated by large banking institutions, which have become an instrument, particularly in the United States, of predation and political control, it's very clear, and which have become locked into a toxic sequence of abusive speculation, collapse, and public rescue, a sequence to which, the end of which we have not yet come. I doubt, in fact, and I realize here that I'm here under the graces of a very distinguished bank, but I doubt that our European colleagues even today are fully aware of the extent to which financial fraud was permitted in the United States and to which it underpinned the world financial crisis affecting the United States and all of Europe because of the way toxic assets were sold by our institutions to customers on this side of the ocean. Let me turn from this sort of overview of the global situation to say a few words about Europe specifically, because here it seems to me the situation is complicated even further by two important factors, especially important factors. The first is that Europe operates under an economic charter that was drafted under the delusions of high neoliberalism, a particular ideology which set markets to be the master of states and also the arbiters of virtue. Say, the judgment of the credit markets was to be given as and accepted as the test of whether national policy was acceptable or unacceptable. It is not just, then, that Europe lacks federal institutions such as do exist now in the United States, but that even if it had those institutions, they would be bound, as the European Central Bank is bound, to an economics of timeless equilibrium and perpetual growth, precisely the economics of the previous era, which has now come to an end. And changing the ideology and the ideas is a precursor to changing the institutions. Failing that, one has, for example, the fiscal suicide compact as the natural outgrowth of the current policy. A sense of people binding themselves to ever more destructive policy actions. But there's also a second thing, which is that as a practical matter, Europe permits stabilizers, rescue mechanisms, the general established functions of a large welfare state to operate more or less in the big and rich countries while denying them to the small and the poor. That's the characteristic response of the crisis. That's why Greece and Spain and Portugal and Ireland are being crushed, while Germany can permit itself certain exceptions to the rules. Right? Italy, of course, is the great exception to that, the peculiar case. A country which is large and rich, but is being treated as though it were small and poor. Italy, therefore, is uniquely situated to act as the linchpin, the Archimedean point, the force that can change thinking and policy at the European scale, and that can act not only to save itself and to save Europe from these destructive ideas and destructive policies. What is the alternative to the ideology of austerity? I say it is not an ideology of stimulus, of which the idea is that you can spend a little and get back to where we were. No. One has to think more richly than that. The true alternative to austerity, it seems to me, is solidarity. It is mutual assistance. It is social insurance. It is to recognize that in more difficult times you have to take better care of people. You have to prevent them from falling too far. You have to make sure that there are jobs available. If you can do that, you can stabilize lives and the economy in a more difficult time. I am the co-author with Yanis Varoufakis and Stuart Holland of something called the Modest Proposal. It has 4 elements. One of them is to use the European Central Bank to establish a sustainable order of sovereign debts in Europe up to within the Maastricht compliant limits. A second one is a case-by-case mechanism to deal with the problem of failed and failing banks, particularly in the European periphery, and to do so on a European basis so that banks don't get turned over to local oligarchs and simply become part of a toxic political system. A third, very important and still now on the agenda but not acted on, is to unlock the European Investment Bank to begin to have a massive program of investments that can begin to reanimate economic activity, particularly in places like the Mezzogiorno, where so many things are needed, but the capacity to do them remains unmobilized. And fourth, to begin to construct a network or a web of arrangements of social solidarity that would operate across Europe. For a very modest beginning, we suggest school lunch programs so that children do not go hungry to school, as is currently the case in some parts of Europe. The former, just passed European Employment Commissioner Laszlo Andor has suggested Europeanizing unemployment insurance. A very sensible idea. So that the people who are most directly hit by the crisis are supported by the community, the European community as a whole. Moving beyond that, I would suggest an equalization of European pensions, a European pension union, as a way of stabilizing the purchasing power of the elderly. All of these things are there not just for human reasons, not just for compassionate reasons, but because once you get them in place, you have a much more stable and much more sustainable economy going forward. I would suggest that the time to think urgently about how to implement these or comparable practical ideas is comparatively short. There will be, I think, a change of government in Greece quite soon with the rise of Syriza and the premiership of Alexis Tsipras, a man who I actually know quite well and like very much. And Greece will become a catalyst for change in Europe as a whole. There is a rise of a movement called Podemos in Spain, which I'm told, according to the polls, if elections were held today, would emerge as the single largest party, just as Syriza did in Greece at the moment of the last elections. And here in Italy, you have a government. You have a government that is capable of addressing the national and the continental interests. And it is very much my hope, this is, of course, I think not exactly common in recent Italian history. It's a new thing. But it is certainly my hope that it will be Italy that steps up to the task of rescuing Europe from the dead hand of the economists of my generation and from essentially the lesser and baser instincts of some of its present governing system. Things will change when they have to. The time is not far. Thank you very much.